I'm Lacy Thomas, and we're going to be talking about Prohibition. Images immediately conjured up when we think of Prohibition are images of speakeasies, flappers, and gangsters. However, we all know that the Roaring Twenties were much more than just a dry period for the country. Children were all taught what the Prohibition meant, and then it lasted for 14 years and ended in 1933 because of President Roosevelt. However, we are never taught what led up to this social experiment and the ramifications that it had on our society. With a little research, we learn that the Prohibition, aka the temperance movement, was 100 years in the making and is broken down into 5 stages. The early development, which lasted between the years of 1820 and 1860. The Gilded Age, which lasted between 1870 and 1890. The Progressive Era, which was 1890 to 1920. National Prohibition was 1920 to 33, and post-repeal, everything since then. The early development of the temperance movement was mainly driven by Protestant churches, whose main complaints were that alcohol were the main causes of poverty, disease, crime, political corruption, and family disruption. The churches believed that if we prohibited the use of the alcohol, that we would reduce the instances of these problems and bring people closer to God. However, a drastic solution, there are some very good points that were made. Drinking was integral in everyday life. It was not uncommon to find a barrel of cider by the back door of a farmhouse, or to find that liquor was being added to cider to aid in the preservation of the drink. Drinking was so deeply ingrained into everyday society that it was not uncommon for someone to have a drink of cider in the morning with breakfast, or to have a drink at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. when the bell tolled on the clock. During this period, the drinking water wasn't really trusted because there wasn't much of an understanding of the growth of bacteria in the drinking water. By 1846, Maine became the first state to pass prohibition laws. The other 12 northern states quickly followed suit. However, these original laws were quickly ratified, and by 1868, Maine was alone in their campaign against alcohol. By 1850, there was social change on the horizon. The anti-slavery movement was coming up, and the temperance movement kind of took a back burner to this much larger issue. So the Gilded Age was a time period when the temperance movement was revived. The Prohibition Party and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, also known as the WCTU, was a big the Prohibition Party had issues with catching their footing. During the time where a man's party affiliation was part of his identity, they were asking men to denounce their party affiliations. The WCTU kind of had a better chance at the party because they had a much better lobbying techniques. The temperance movement quickly became rooted in with racial tones. Older Americans viewed the German, Irish, and Italian immigrants as drunkards, since drinking was deeply rooted into their culture identities. The Republicans and Democrats of the time refused to take a stance on either side of the line and decided to leave any actual policy development up to local governments. Temperance movement used this to their advantage and pushed to have prohibition laws to be instituted in their state constitutions, then set their sights on the federal level. Next is the Progressive Era. This is when the temperance movement finally made some real progress. During the 1890s, anti-liquor Protestants founded the Anti-Saloon Leagues. Shortly after its founding, the League joined forces with the WCTU, which finally spread their cause nationwide. The Anti-Saloon League turned its sights on the saloons themselves. preaching to the people outside of the saloons and then causing damage and chaos inside of them. One of the biggest supporters and most famous members of the league was Carrie Nation. She was known for smashing the decor and merchandise of the saloons with a hatchet. Carrie Nation also fought against the use of tobacco, foreign foods, corsets, short skirts, and mild porn. By 1914, the U.S. was gearing up for World War I, and the public was embroiled in some anti-German hysteria, and the government went into rationing mode. They decided they were going to save all of the grains for the production of food instead of grain alcohol. The political environment of the time period directly resulted in the passage of the Lever Act of 1917. The Lever Act prohibited the use of grain in the production of alcohol. The passage of this act was only a stepping stone of what would become the Prohibition. Finally, we're in the main act, National Prohibition, right? So National Prohibition happened on January 16th, 1920. Congress finally successfully enacted the Volstead Act. That's what we call Prohibition. President Wilson originally vetoed the act, and Congress thought it was a better idea to override him. They passed the Volstead Act. As kids, we usually think that the prohibition was actually a ban on the act of actually drinking. However, we find that the prohibition was actually a prohibition on the manufacturing, transportation, and sale of alcohol. However, the people didn't want to be deterred. They still wanted to drink. So this drove drinking underground, and it led to the creation of speakeasies and bootleggers and organized crime. The enforcement of this new policy was a bit of a gray area. The federal government left most of the policing up to the local authorities. The enforcement of these new laws created a rise in the prison system population. Before Prohibition, federal convicts was at 4,000 people. By 1932, that number had increased to nearly 27,000 people in federal institutions. By the 1930s, the people had become disillusioned by Prohibition, and it began to lose its public support. The public began to view Prohibition with lawlessness and political corruption, which led to its ratification. All right, post-appeal. At the end of an era, right? On December 5th, 1932, President Roosevelt officially ratified the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was replaced with what was called the Federal Alcohol Act of 1933, preventing saloons from selling from only one brew house. This is also called the tied house system. The public began to view social faux pas such as smoking, drugs, gambling, and sex outside of marriage as an acceptable caveat to modern society. The unforeseen consequences of Prohibition was organized crime and federal law enforcement. Prohibition had created an environment in which organized crime had thrived. The revocation of the Volstead Act did not dissolve the intense network of organized crime throughout our country. Instead, they just turned their sights somewhere new. They went to trafficking and racketeering and gambling, extortion, bank robbery, and prostitution. And in the federal government, it led to the founding of the FBI. We are all taught that the Prohibition happened and that it ended 14 years later. We all know that it enabled the growth of organized crime. We are not told about what the driving force behind this life-changing movement was, or that it took 100 years. Prohibition was more than these images fed to us of speakeasies, dark and smoky jazz-filled shows, flappers, and mobsters. This was a social movement that took over 100 years to implement, only to come crashing down, being labeled as a failed social experiment.